Sorry to interrupt the conversation. I think everybody was quite animated and had a lot to talk about. But I'm Bill Dutton. This is going to be very different from what you've heard before. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to swear off any attributions, but I'm a social scientist, so not even my co-authors necessarily agree with what I'm going to say. And I'm going to talk about, I wouldn't have answered, when I put this title together, Feeling Secure Online, I just forgot about what this morning's discussion would be, and probably nobody would answer that question positively. But what I'm going to talk to you about is what I think is a dimension that is under-researched. A lot of the cybersecurity research focuses on technical infrastructures and also institutional policies and practices, including national policy, but very little focuses on the individual, what their practices are. And by those what we look at in the social cultural dimensions of cybersecurity would be people's attitudes, their concerns, whether they trust being online, their beliefs, is what they do private, are they secure online, what know-how do they have, and what actions are they taking to secure their privacy. So these are the focus of our inquiry, and we're interested in, first of all, I think three major questions, and we're in a sort of the middle or beginning of a pursuit of these questions. One is, how serious are public concerns about privacy and security? How are they changing over time? Are they getting worse or better or more comfortable? And how are they distributed, both socially and globally? Are concerns more concentrated in the West or the East, and as we talked about this morning, and I think some of our findings are, I think, surprising to me, and we'll see what you think. But what the basis of these findings are, two major studies. One, in Britain, we have some detailed data that come out of the Oxford Internet Surveys. We started those in 2003. We have, every 2 years, we go out, we have field interviews with over 2,000 people. It's a multi-stage probability sample. We can extrapolate to the UK as a whole. And the last one was done February, March 2013. A second set of data comes from our collaboration with the World Economic Forum. In 2010, we did the first survey, which was a web-based survey, not face-to-face and field interviews, but with 5,400 users in 13 countries. And we went out again in 2012, and we're just within days going to issue the report from that survey, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that was, again, a web-based survey conducted in 9 languages, and it was fielded in July, September 2012 by ComScore, and we also got supplemental funding from ICT Qatar, and we added many of the Middle Eastern countries and more languages and so forth to have 11,225 respondents in 63 countries. So we have a global perspective as well as a more focused UK perspective on a number of issues. The countries where we have more than 300 respondents in the 2012 survey are listed here. Many of the countries we've discussed this morning, such as Brazil, for example, US, China, are in our sample, and we can look in more depth at them. I'm not going to focus on specific countries. I want to try to focus on some global patterns that come out of the 2 reports. The first report was called The New Internet World, which was published in 2011, and this report that will come out in a few days, I hope, is, it would have come out earlier, but we had a security problem. It was blocked by the by the forum because the file was too large. But so it's titled The Internet Bubble, and that'll probably be a key focus of what I have to say today. But because we were discussing cultures of the internet this morning, I think it might be useful just to quickly give you some sense of what we found in our first survey about the new internet world, because it is a bit different. And much of the discussion of cultures of the internet that you heard this morning was focused on the policy level and political administrative traditions in various countries. And we're focusing on internet users globally. And there we found, well, first of all, that not only is the internet becoming global, but the demography of the internet is changing dramatically, so that the West is now becoming a smaller and smaller proportion of the internet population. So as the Southeast Asia, China, the global South becomes dominant online, will this value differences or cultural differences really make a huge difference in what we think is protected online and what is not? What we found was that there's more of a convergence of cultures online than we expected. And in fact, we argue that that internet users globally share a number of common values that are very fundamental to the internet, such as freedom of expression, concerns over privacy and authenticity are globally concerns. And what was surprising that in some cases, the new internet world, the new arrivals to the internet demography are sometimes more concerned about freedom of expression than are people in the West, who sometimes, I think, are more complacent about some of the things they take for granted online. And also that the users in the new internet world are orders of magnitude at some points more active in user-generated content, in user-generated innovation. I'm just sure that user-generated innovation is going to be coming from China and the new internet world, and not from the West, because they're just orders of magnitude more active online in all sorts of ways. But this coming report had a different theme, and I guess I'm going to go into this. I mean, you don't need to read all the small print, but it's the basic theme of the report is that, again, like in our 2010 survey, globally there is support for freedom of expression online. And for example, 78% view access to the internet as a fundamental right, and a similar proportion believe people should be able to say what they feel about their government online, and also many feel that they should be able to be anonymous at times. But a bare majority believe it is safe to express their views online. And 71% think that they have to be careful about what they say online. In other words, there's a great support for freedom of expression, but self-regulation of what people say. They feel that they are being monitored. And again, in terms of privacy and security, there's a huge sense in which people believe the internet is putting their privacy at risk, and that most people believe that they are being monitored online. And this is obviously pre-Edward Snowden. And so any Snowden effect is not in this data at all. And there is some worry also that the users in the emerging nations are somewhat less aware of these risks and more trusting. But also globally, there's concern over the authenticity of information online, particularly crowdsourced information and so forth. But let me zero in on some of these issues. I know I've got very limited time, so I'm going to whiz through this, but personal information about me is collected on the internet for reasons I do not know, 58%. All of these beliefs about online privacy are pretty worrisome in the sense that people do not perceive their privacy to be that guarded. And so most people online are worried about it. The government monitors what people do on the internet. 50% of the internet users globally perceive that to be the case. Security online, and I know the boundaries between security and privacy are very blurred, but do I have control of the information I disclose about myself online? 62% do, but personal information put online is kept safe, 45%. So there's some greater sense of security, but huge proportions believe they are not safe. Same with online security, breaking into your inter-counter email, 72%. Information you provided for one purpose is being used for another purpose, 67%. So you may be interested in this. This is, do you trust these various actors to protect your personal data online? And in the UK, actually, people trust ISPs and the internet service providers more than they do the government. But globally, the internet service providers and social network providers and so forth are not very trusted compared to, they're close to online marketers and ad agencies in terms of this. So there's a serious problem with trust in internet providers globally. I don't have time probably for this, but I think if you look at the UK, there's some surprising trends that there's high levels of concern over privacy, but it's very stable over time. So there's not a huge perturbations in concerns over privacy, high but steady. And also there's declining concern over some things like viruses, bank details, obscene emails, but there are small but increasing concerns over such things as misrepresentation of things online and the stolen bank card details because they are online. And the last thing I'll say is that we're trying to look at differences across users and their concerns and what they do online. And one of the interesting findings is that the newer internet users are more frequently engaged in what you might say is less secure practices. So sharing personal information exchange for free content, much more likely if you're online. If you're online longer, you're a little more guarded about sharing information. You're less likely to accept connections from someone they do not know offline, and they're much less likely to open an attachment when they do not know the sender. So we're looking at potentially vulnerable groups based upon this survey research, and we're trying to, I think our foci is we've got this global sense that there is a trust bubble. We've talked this morning about how important the internet is to every sector of society, and it goes on trust. I mean, people do trust the internet in the UK, for example, as much as they do broadcast news, more than they do the news press for getting information, also for entertainment. But if we lose that trust, which is, I mean, there's some evidence in this data that we could lose that trust, and there could be a bubble that could be burst around the issue of privacy. That's critical, and we need to research this area and keep following it. But what we're doing now in this study is looking at the cross-national differences, trying to make good sense of those, and the differences among users, and how these levels of trust translate into how people are using the internet online. As the vitality of the internet may be at stake in terms of how those wash out. Thank you very much. Okay.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to begin our session. I have to turn my mic on just to say. Don't want to turn it on that much. So can you turn it down quite a bit, please? Turn it down quite a bit. So this session is, turn it right down, please, or I'll have to turn it off. So this session is about case studies, and I have to confess that I'm from a business school, so I'm used to using case studies in a very different way than others might be. I happen to believe that these kinds of skills are critical in cybersecurity for the education of boards and MBAs and people at all levels. And in fact, at the business school at Oxford, we've started a collaboration with computer science to teach people about these things. So why case studies? And what are case studies for? Well, I'd argue that in the education of people for managing cybersecurity, particularly for managers, they're not about exemplars of best practice. They don't work. People just say, oh, that's very cool for them. You know, I'm glad they've done that. Scaring people doesn't work. They say, oh, okay, that's bad, but it's not us. What does tend to work are the case studies should be field-driven, so they have to come from problems out of the field, not problems that academics imagine them to be. So we've got to see what real managers want. They need to have a narrative, so that you know what the company's about. They need a dilemma, a real manager's dilemma, so that they're stuck on the horns of one. They need learning points, and they need discussion among the managers. And from that, what we hope to do is develop general principles that are timely, that are good for right now. because of the manager's experience. One of the things we know about boards is we could say, well, boards simply need to know about that. So being on a board, I can tell you that no, boards need to know a lot. They need to know about Sarbanes-Oxley, they need to know about Dodd-Frank. This stuff on cybersecurity gets pushed to the side quite a bit. But let me give you a couple of examples of the dilemmas that we would have in one of the cases. So one of them is, how do we manage a cyber crisis? What should we do? Now people say, well, that's obvious. You just kind of report it and get it out of the way. Managers don't see it like that. They have to think about the reputational effect of reporting a cyber incident. What about if your computers are being used to attack your best competitors' computers? This is the case that Sadie and I used in our MBA class. What about things like insider threats, whether they're benign or malicious? When they exist in your supply chain, what do you do then? What about if they involve collaboration with another partner? What do you do then if you suspect your other partner, but you haven't really got strong evidence, but it could destroy the partnership? One of the things that we dealt with recently is not exfiltration, but infiltration of data. One of your employees wants to increase their status in the organization and therefore infiltrates data. And you're not sure exactly where it comes from, but it could have come from a competitor and you could be sued for it. So these are the kinds of things that we think about in management education. Now, I'd like to use a quick analog for this. This is not something new. It's not something totally new. We saw this in safety 25 years ago. It used to be that we'd have a corporate safety officer and they'd be responsible for everybody's safety. Companies like Alcoa and DuPont distributed that awareness and they distributed responsibility for safety. That might be a great model for us to use in cybersecurity. I don't know, but it could be a good managerial model. So these are the elements I think are important for a good safety, for a good case study. And also I think they're the ones that give us the best chance of educating boards, managers, and people all the way up through the tree where we need to tell them these are the problems that real people are having with cybersecurity in business. Thanks. Now with that, I'd like to pass over to Professor Basie van Solms, who's Director of the Cybersecurity Center at the University of Johannesburg and who was also my host last week. So thank you, Basie.
Can I have your mobile?
You can.
Please.
It's very loud. It makes you feel very important.
Yeah, like yourself.
Yeah, but it's just a feeling. It's not real.
That's just it's virtual.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Thanks to Sadie for inviting me. I found it a privilege to be here, and I found it a privilege to be involved with the activities of the school and the center. So what I'd like to talk to you very briefly, I've got 20 minutes and I'd like to finish before the 20 minutes is up because I've got some other issues I'd like to put on the table too. So what I'd like to do is firstly give you some idea of the status of cybersecurity in South Africa. And you'll be shocked as I am. Then I'd like to say something about some results in terms of awareness issues, awareness programs that's going on in South Africa. Some programs as far as cybersecurity capacity building is concerned, and then specifically some comments, short comments on the type of research we're doing in South Africa and sort of in Africa as such. This is not an academic research presentation. It is just feeding back to you some of the initiatives. At the end, I may say something that's more research oriented. Let's start off by looking at Africa and South Africa specifically. The newest Norton report of this year states that South Africa has the third highest number of cybercrime victims in the world. We're second to China and Russia. Now that statement alone should be a big embarrassment to the South African government. But maybe the South African government is saying because we joined BRICS, we want to be there. I don't know. But the fact is, that's bad. The FBI states South Africa is a cybercrime hotspot. It lists South Africa as the 6th most active country where cybercrime takes place. Now, there are many reasons for that. And I can have a full presentation with you looking at all the different reasons which I think should be highlighted in some research report, maybe some cooperative report afterwards. But I'd like to do on 2 areas because that's what I was asked to do. I'd like to say something a little bit about what are the reasons, and the 2 main reasons: lack of cybersecurity awareness amongst everybody in the country, and insufficient cybersecurity knowledge and capacity building. Lack of cybersecurity awareness. We've got no government involvement in South Africa at all. And I will say more about that because that is a big issue, and that's part of the reason why we are number 3rd on the list. A very important aspect in terms of Africa is the technology jump. A recent research project stated that the majority of learners at schools indicated that they only have access to cell phones as technology devices, and they only use cell phones, and only 7% of them said we've had exposure to desktop computers before the time. And that's typical of Africa. They are dumped, everybody's dumped into the mobile environment with no experience of antiviruses and these type of things on traditional desktop environments. And that's typical for the developing world. That's why a developed world solution is not directly transportable to a developing country, and specifically South Africa. Specifically, our problem now is that people are doing lots of business transactions. A large percentage of Africa and South Africa is unbanked. They don't have bank accounts. Now the banks are providing cyberspace-based solutions, mobile-based solutions to transfer money. Many of them are working and they're sending money back home at the end of the month. And that's done by, you don't have a bank account, you put in the money on your cell phone and it's sent somewhere, and somebody with another cell phone can get it from ATM. That's the type of systems being rolled out, and that's maybe why we're number 3. I don't know. As far as cybersecurity capacity building is concerned, we've got no government involvement. There's no formal government programs. We started some programs. No nationally organized program, and a big demand from industry. I'll come back to that in terms of the research visit that was done by Professor David Upton and Alexandra Ellis last week in South Africa. Let's look at the awareness issue. Let me briefly give you some ideas of what we have done, because we don't get any guidance, we don't get any input from the government. So we as a group of academics have decided we will do something. There are several research projects in South Africa in terms of awareness. They are totally uncoordinated, no government involvement. There's one by the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, mainly to go out to the rural areas and train the teachers, saying, teachers, this is what you must teach your school children, but very on a rather high level. And then there's the initiative of SACSA, the South African Cybersecurity Academic Alliance, which goes out to schools. And that's the one that I'm involved in that I'd like to say something about. 3 universities are involved in the South African Cybersecurity Academic Alliance: University of South Africa, the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, and my own university. Now, what do? Let's first look at what Unisa did. Unisa created a lot of workbooks, which they take to schools. I've got some copies here. I'm not going to go through them, but it's really for primary school children. It talks about cyber stalking, it talks about cyber bullying. It's got some games in there, it's got some connected dots, etc. I leave some of the copies at the back here. If you are the last person, you can take the copy. So I've got some other examples too which you can use. But this at the moment is translated into except from English, it's also in Zulu and also in Xhosa. And that's going physically to the schools, through the teachers, and involved in that. There's lots of posters created by SACSA and distributed to schools. The cybersecurity pledge, I've got some copies here, where actually in the school environment, the pledges are given to the kids and they actually explain to them and they sign it. And you can read the pledge. It says, I will not go to foreign places on the internet. I will tell my parents what I do. I will tell my parents if somebody wants to make contact with me illegally. They sign the pledge, their parents sign the pledge, and they keep it somewhere. And here's an example of a large group of people which just signed their pledges, and they actually are quite proud about the fact that they've got this pledge. And this works. It works, and I'll give you some comments now about that. Some feedback from this project. We need more information on this topic. We need more workshops to empower ourselves to protect ourselves. I signed the pledge to show I will be cyber safe. So at least something is happening from this academic alliance. The Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University has got a lot of work in terms of the poster competition. There's their National Cybersecurity Poster Contest for this year. They get a lot of submissions right through the country, and what they did last year is all the best ones they put into a calendar, this sort of table calendar which they provide to schools and right over the world. They've got a lot of flyers, Facebook Safety 101, Password Safety 101, etc., which are distributed to schools. Let's look at the awareness issue, the capacity building issue. So awareness-wise, something is happening, but totally because of the fact that a number of academics said, we must do something. We are third on the list. We must come down on the list. And those initiatives are happening, and I think are having good results. But no government involvement, and I'll keep coming back to that. Cybersecurity capacity building. No government involvement. No formal programs at all in South Africa in terms of capacity building. So again, somebody at my university, we decided, fine, we'll create something. We created our certificate in cybersecurity, and we created our certificate in digital forensics, which will be start running next year. This module, which is really out there, and I'll give you some feedback just now, 5 modules, 3 days each for people working in industry. Middle last year, we started it. We had 8 people coming on the course. Beginning of this year, we were oversubscribed. We had to take another intake middle of the year to do that, and we are again oversubscribed. So the next one does that. But it's very superficial in the sense it covers the main topics, but people go back, and many of them that came back already said, we're using this in our work now. We're giving courses to our people, our employees, based on the course. You can see there, introduction to cybersecurity, encryption techniques, digital forensics, malicious software, and then cybersecurity governance, critical information infrastructure protection, cybercrime, and cyber warfare. There's a big interest from Africa, and that's one issue that I'm going to speak to Sadie about. I get a lot of interest from Africa saying we want to do the course, but we can't come to South Africa because it's too expensive. So I'd like to move the course to an online distance platform, so that they can register wherever they are. And that's our initiative for next year, to provide this, because the demand is big not only in South Africa but also internationally. And I will come back to that again in terms of David's research visit last year. Digital forensics course, this one incidentally is 5 modules of 3 days each, spread over a semester, 3 modules of 3 days each. A lot of practical work, big demand for that. Now let me evaluate, and then I'm finished. Firstly, South Africa, cyber-wise, is in deep trouble. There's no doubt about it. And the main reason for that, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll say it here, and I'm not sure whether there are any people from the government here, because of the government's lack of movement. That's why we're number 3. This is supported by the research visit last week. I think it was a big success. David Upton came there with Alex, and we went to for 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday last week. We went to 6 different companies, major companies. I think it was a success. Maybe he doesn't. He can report on that. But the results coming from these 6 major companies in South Africa, the government is not doing its job. We want more guidance, as he already said. We want to say, how do we approach our board? How do we convince our board that this must happen? Thirdly, biggest problem, the absence of the government. We've got a national cybersecurity policy framework, which was approved by the cabinet 2 years ago. It's still secret. Nobody must talk about it. Nobody knows about it. And lots of these things, the responsibility for awareness, the responsible capacity building is set out in that document. We know it, but it's secret. Nobody must talk. Nobody must know about it. We're number 3. We'd like to be number 3. That's what I think. The initiatives discussed above, all the things I talked about now, are done by a number of individuals who are not willing to wait for those who should provide guidance, support and finance. In the interest of South Africa, we are hacking open the way, so eventually when the penny drops, we're there. We at the University of Johannesburg Cybersecurity Centre are anxious to work with this new centre, and congratulations to its establishment. We can have a specific viewpoint in terms of developing countries and the difference. We talked about culture this morning. There's absolutely a culture difference between the way you look after private information and private things from that viewpoint that we have here. At the moment, we've got a number of research projects going. We're looking at a formal model for cybersecurity capacity building. What do we mean? It's not only multidisciplinary, it's also multidimensional. And we're trying to put all this into a 3 or a 4-dimensional model. We've got a model on thick and thin. Somebody referred to ISPs earlier on. We're moving to a model for the South Africans, for the Africans to protect themselves, to provide more responsibility to ISPs in terms of securing it because of the lack of awareness down here. We've got this community-based incident response team, which we're basically creating again with whatever research funds we have, basically based on the WARP model in the UK. We started a project on cyber counterintelligence, which seemed to be very interesting to the business people. We're working on agent technology in CIIP, more secure payment systems, etc., etc. So, finally, Mr. Chair, I'm finished. How can we work together? Firstly, we must understand the differences in Africa as far as cybersecurity is concerned. And I think we can provide a viewpoint on that. We can support the development of best practices and guidelines for African situations, which are different. The ITU provided some documentation. It's not very good. And share research solutions to cybersecurity problems in Africa. It's been said this morning already, and I say it again. Cyberspace can only be secured by working together. This is a global center. And I think lots of things that are being discussed this morning, had been discussed, can be of value to Africa. Thanks for being here. I appreciate the time. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Want this?
I'd like to pass over now to David Bray. David is the CIO of the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and has a few things to say that we'd love to hear.
All right, thank you. Let me just pull up the slides real quick. Well, thank you all for having me. As mentioned, I do come from the Federal Communications Commission, although like another speaker, I have to say that these are my personal views. They represent my own views and do not represent the views of any endorsement of any government agency. With that said, again, I want to thank you for having me here. This does actually bring back some memories. I was here in 2007 with Bill at the Oxford Internet Institute. We were having discussions about cybersecurity then. Again, in 2010, we were talking about cybercrime, and actually a lot of the similar conversations are happening. It's good that those conversations are broadening, but it does sort of feel like, in some respects, we actually did talk about the car model back in 2010. It was brought up that actually the car, when it occurred about 10 years later, was actually the advent of the rise of, in terms of Bonnie and Clyde, interstate crime, and eventually the creation of the FBI, and that took about sort of 40 years. And so it's worth thinking about, yes, technology is great, but there's always, like everything, it's sort of amoral. It's how us humans use it to determine whether it's good or bad. But I'm here to talk to you about creating a cybersecurity commons. And on there is actually a map of the world. It's kind of hard to see because unfortunately the light's bright, but those were lights from space taken by NASA back in the early 1990s. And it sort of shows you the world as points. What's interesting though is if you compare that, and what you can see as we go to it, is this is actually a map of Facebook friends, and it shows connections. Now what's interesting is what part of the world stays lit and what part of the world disappears. You may notice that China disappears. Russia's kind of a little bit more dark too. Africa is lighting up, but that was actually created about 4 years ago, and I'm sure if it was updated now, it would be even more robust. But it's the idea that we're moving from points to connections. And I think that's something that's really key to think about when we look for solutions. We can't look for point solutions. We have to look for connection solutions. And that's not something that we're used to. In fact, policy doesn't really do well with things that span horizontal connections. Policy is actually trying to focus more on a sort of simple connection. So, why does a common matter? Well, in certain respects, the news actually wrote itself for me before I came to this event. This only happened about 3 days ago. US internet service providers had their traffic unwittingly routed through Iceland and Belarus. And that was done using what was called the Border Gateway Protocol. It's one of the frameworks of TCP/IP and is inherently unsecure because anyone can publish their gateway routing table. Anyone can claim and say, I'm in the United States and I can handle those connections for you, even if they're not actually in the United States. So this is an interesting challenge that presents itself that I don't think any amount of law will be able to solve. It's actually something that we actually have to think about, how do we solve it connectively? The other reason why is, do you know where your internet traffic is being routed? How many of us can say when you send that message, you may think you're sending it between Oxford and London, but do you know if it's really going to another country before it actually gets to London? Equally, as I said, border gateway routing tables are inherently insecure. Next step. Well, this is again a headline from just a few days ago about the UK talking about the rise of criminals actually using Bitcoin. I've heard some people talk about, well, if we follow the money, non-state actors are actually followed by the money, but now they're actually using a source of money that's very hard for governments to track. And it's not just about Bitcoin. There are now at least 100 different clones of Bitcoin now on the rise too, that make it very difficult to actually follow where the money is going for these activities. And so there's a rise of cybercrime and spear phishing, doing what's called data extortion, where I actually have now infected your system and locked down your data, and if you want it back, you'll need to pay me in some sort of currency. And it's really sort of a 20% human problem. It's not so much a technology problem. And so how do we do that and how do we tackle that? Then also sort of looking at a horizon, there's this sort of ubiquitous sort of Internet of Things. You can look at it in terms of how confident are you getting in that car that's going to drive itself? How confident are you going to be with that pacemaker that's inside of you? How confident are you going to be with that glass that you're wearing, or that watch that you're wearing, or the limb that you're using? Or as we mentioned around here, there are cameras everywhere. How confident that they're only being used by the government to watch what's going on? This is the world we're moving into, where it's going to be these several semi-autonomous devices distributed, some of which will actually be inside of us. How confident are we that they're actually going to be doing what they're supposed to be doing? That's why a commons matters. So, as mentioned, we're going to be connected directly to the internet, and it's actually going to be embodied in us. And what happens when things that are embodied in us can now be attacked digitally? So, how would a commons work? Well, if you think about it, it's that every node on the internet could be a sensor. And it could let you know in near real time, machine to machine, getting humans out of the loop, because if the human's involved, it's too late automatically. Machine to machine exchanges at massive scale as to what's affecting them. Known participants voluntarily will share what's hitting their different nodes in the network, and they can actually share anonymously what attacks they observe. That could be what's hitting their firewall if they choose to share it. It could be what they're seeing in terms of their routing and their traffic. If you think about that, what just happened 3 days ago, ISPs should have seen that their traffic was actually being routed to Iceland and to Belarus, but they weren't watching, and nobody actually had no one to share it to in machine-to-machine time. So it would actually be a place that was a voluntary model, and people would be sharing what's actually they're seeing on their own individual sort of island. As they share that, akin to fire alarms, then when that gets shared, the entire commons can be aware of what actually has happened. So it's a trusted third party that actually does know the participants in the system, but is actually treating it as if it's anonymous information, and is actually allowing these patterns to be shared amongst all other participants in the system. We're all better off if we know what's actually affecting each of us individually. We can begin to look for trends. If you think about what happened in January and February, you may have been following the news, there was a rise of denial of service attacks in the United States. They were targeting specific sectors. Well, those sectors may have actually each individually gone to their ISPs to have additional bandwidth in case they did have a denial of service attack. But what happens if they each contracted with the same ISPs and an entire sector is now being affected? You now have a DDoS that effectively is taking down the entire sector because they can't all provide the additional bandwidth. So it's the idea that we either all hang separately or we hang together. And if you really think about it in cybersecurity, that's what we really need to be thinking about, is how can we all be more informed by what's affecting us individually? And then from that, you could actually imagine a future in which you could actually now have real-time longitudinal data, which we currently don't have, of the state of the public infrastructure. What is hitting the .coms? What is hitting the customers? And you can actually run simulations and say, what if we had done this intervention? What if we had done something differently? It would be a great model to actually inform policymakers so we could actually ground what we're saying in data. And you can also then imagine, ultimately, if you actually have some trust in that system, you can actually distribute patches to that system. You could actually have them change their configuration based on the attack surface they're seeing. And again, it would have to be something outside of government. It would actually have to be this trusted commons that involves the public and the private sector. So I'll close with this idea of what would it actually benefit. Well, first, clear the private sector. We know that there is anonymous and reporting that could be shared, and so that would actually free them of the concern that if they reveal they've been attacked, if they reveal that they've had a vulnerability, that actually opens them up for a lawsuit. And so in a lot of cases, companies hold back on the attacks that are facing them because they're worried about what that's going to do to their reputation or initial and civil criminal actions. Equally, it would actually benefit the nonprofits. There would be a niche for cyber watchdogs that could look at that anonymous data and see what was going on, sound the alarm. Also, oftentimes, nonprofits can't afford the amount of money it takes to actually have strong cybersecurity defenses. So in this case, by participating in the commons, they benefit from the collective intelligence of all. And finally, and probably most importantly, the public. They could also contribute. They contribute by watching. They could actually choose to download an open source application that would allow them on their devices to share what they're seeing that's hitting them, and at the same time have their firewalls, have their sort of infrastructure be strengthened as a result too. Again, making it open source, so you can sort of relieve any concerns that it's somehow a mysterious backdoor to some government agency. Unless that sounds sort of far-fetched, this is not cybersecurity, but the Federal Communications Commission, we did just release on Thursday of 2 weeks ago, we released an application that anyone can download that 3 times a day it will actually check the speed of your internet connection and then report that to a third party anonymously, which then packages it and can actually produce a map of the United States that's effectively crowdsourcing the speed of internet connectivity across the United States. Now imagine the same thing being used for the purposes for cybersecurity, same thing possibly using for disaster response, because actually if you think about it, digital security and disaster response security is very similar. It's quite possible. So with that said, hopefully this teed up some interesting discussions. I look forward to talking to you each later, and thanks for having me.
I'd now like to introduce David Pollington, who's Director of International Security Relations at Microsoft. Thank you, David.
I'm quite happy to stand here for the presentation. And if you bear with me a minute, I'll find my presentation. So, earlier on David talked about case studies, and what I want to do is give you effectively a case study of Microsoft. What have we been doing in cybersecurity and capacity building for the past 11 years? So you'll see on the agenda, this it's got a very elegant title about growing business around the world. And I'm going to come back to that because unashamedly, I work for a company and the company succeeds because people like the product, they buy the product, it generates funds and enables me to have a job, which enables me to say to you, I make no disclaimer. I represent Microsoft. This is my day job. What I say is what we do, and I'm here to learn. And the other thing I want to say before I start is I want to say, well, welcome to all the people in the room who know what they're talking about and have heard many of the things that we've been said already again and again and again for the past 10 years. So one of the things I want to do is to look at the world and look at the job we have in hand at a higher level. I want to make sure there's no risk of anything that we say being in any way patronizing, because it doesn't matter where anybody is in the spectrum of cybersecurity. It's all about maturity. It's about the intellectual ability that people already have. So what I'm going to come back to at the end is a point made by the professor I derived from his presentation earlier on. This is not about intelligence or will. It's about ability and awareness of the issues that need to be addressed. So what is our market and what does the world look like to us? Well, I've got an animation that I want to run through, which just generally will draw the picture for me. Colleagues of mine in our team did an analysis, and basically this analysis took the world, or rather 80 countries out of the world, and it said, let's just draw a square on a map, and the area of the square is the number of people online. The darkness of the green is the proportion of that country that are online. And so I just ask you to look at the map as it changes from 2000 to 2005 to 2010 and 15 and 2020. That's been our last 13 years and the 7 to come. In that time, in 2012, we passed 2 billion people online. By 2020, in only 7 years, there'll be 4 billion people online. The first 2 billion people online are all from developed countries, almost all, 90+%. Almost all of the people who are going to come online in the next 7 years are in developing countries. The point's been made, and I've heard it said, that there are children in Africa who are getting mobile phones before they get shoes. There are people who depend on their water for a text message on an SMS phone. Those things can be abused. That's what cybersecurity is about. For us as a business, we've got well over 1 billion customers in the world, primarily using PCs. Because really, how many of you in this room have got a Windows phone, honestly? I think they're great. I love them. I think one day we'll get there. But let's be real about how this works. And so there's different types of technology being used. It's not about Microsoft. It's not about any one company. I've got representative colleagues around the audience from antivirus companies, other manufacturers and builders of the cyberspace. The point that's been made is that cyberspace is built primarily by private sector for commercial purposes. It is our job every day to wake up and innovate. It is our job every day to wake up and compete. The question is, how do we do that in a way that's constructive for everybody? So they'd all have a chart. And this is not for you to read, it's purely an illustration of 10 years' work. This is 10 years' work in cybersecurity for trustworthy computing. That's the organization that I work for. That 10 years of work has seen all different types of threats. We've had web defacements, we've had worms, we've had botnets, we've had targeted attacks. That means that, when we think about it, none of those things have gone away. Any country that is starting to grapple with its own cybersecurity, any company, any organization, any community, is starting somewhere on that spectrum. You can have your website defaced today. It never went away. There are worms propagating today. Botnets are making a lot of money, thank you very much. There are happy criminals out there somewhere. And we don't talk about it very much, except to point fingers. And really the concept of targeted attack is this difference. It's the difference between crime is stealing what's in my pocket today, what's on my credit card today. Espionage and targeted attacks, that's stealing the future. That's who you want to be and where you're going. And it really doesn't. It does matter. If you're going to triage and do the forensics, what matters is its prevalence. And so when we think about it, we have to think about this whole spectrum of cybersecurity and what are we going to do about it, from raising awareness to triaging the targeted attacks that come along. And those are the things that we need to talk to people in the countries which are getting this together and realizing it's a priority for them. You know, in this period of time, this is an organization that we work with here, FOSI, Family Online Safety Institute. This is a map of the countries in the world where we have collaborated and we've helped to provide online awareness in a relevant language. Yeah, we generally work to about 33 languages in the world, and we're not trying to do all of the languages, but at least there's a relevant language which is at least second language for somebody to use. There are white spaces. As you look at the chart, there are white spaces all over Africa, and we need to work towards dealing with that. There are white spaces in Latin America. We need to address these sorts of things. Because when we look at the world, one of the other things that I've been associated with for 11 years is something called the Security Cooperation Program. The Security Cooperation Program is a program we put together for our material. It's merely a way of helping a government, or in some cases actually it's been a national cert which is non-governmental, to collate the information necessary to understand the threat that exists and be able to respond to it. It's coordinated information, and that's the sort of thing we need to do. But because we've lived in a world of developed countries, we've got 80 countries signed up who to one degree or another are developed. That should be 180 countries, and we should find a way to make it more available. And if we're going to make it more available, we shouldn't ask people to travel anywhere. There shouldn't actually be paper that they have to get. We have to work out how to do automated awareness and automated information sharing. And so we're working on that, and we want to be able to take that forward and share that. Now, when I think about the context and I think about this, I want to keep coming back to the fact that, you know, I'm a businessman, I'm focused on cybersecurity, I no longer am involved in business transactions. I don't sell for a living anymore, I used to. Now I'm more concerned that the right policies in place that enables my colleagues to sell for a living, because otherwise I get no salary. This is an initiative we've got on which is addressing Africa as a continent, trying to understand and grapple with the fact that there are all of those statistics which are intentionally there just to be mind-numbingly small and saturate with you with information, because I'm not going to choose particular ones. There's just so much to talk about in terms of that particular continent. But in terms of for Africa, we've started out with youth programs to try and raise awareness. We want to be able to share and collaborate with those sorts of things. Women's groups, in order to get women into ICT training, because they've got all the skills, they could use those sorts of skills. We have apps on our phones just like other people have apps on their phones, and we have apps on our environment, so we want to encourage people to make apps relative to their environment. For us, it would be cool if somebody got their water through an app. Those are the sorts of things that we want to move forward. A phone. The point's been made about phones coming in first. Phones will come in first. The developing world will leapfrog over the developed world. It does not have the legacy. It can jump to mobile and cloud as quickly as it wants to. It can do that and will do that by realizing that it needs data protection laws quickly and readily. If we talk in that sort of language, then we're capacity building. And so when we've looked at it, we thought you actually need a device. Your average mobile phone is a bit difficult to use when the battery needs to be recharged every day and you need to be fairly close to the base station. So we've built a phone with Huawei that's got twice the range and twice the battery life. We're working on a number of things like this to merge together the policy and education which is necessary to raise the awareness across the whole world so that cybersecurity can be dealt with equitably across all these different countries regardless of their state of evolution, whilst at the same time putting forward on the table our technology, which we think is going to be cool enough to choose and people are going to want to continue to use. And that's where we're going to try and do this. So I want to find that cool enough to choose space in terms of policy. We've done a number of pieces of analysis. The green charts I showed you at the beginning are on a website I'll reference at the end, and they were a way of looking at how you link policy to the practical reality of the world in terms of the Cybercrime Convention and other things. This here is a way of looking at national cyber strategies. We've done an analysis across 33 countries, looking at what national cyber security strategy looks like and making a comparison. I only wanted to talk about it for a minute just to say that the talking about this and producing papers does come fundamentally at depth from academia. But it does come also from industry, because we do this sort of research. It's not just about how many infections did we have, what was the result of last month's survey of 700 million machines which told us who was infected with what. We have that kind of data and we would share it. We're all about sharing in the right context for the right purpose. And that's what I think Oxford has the opportunity to do, because really this is a situation where we've got a team, we've been working for a while, we could look after our customers in our set. But our customers don't just use a floating piece of Microsoft without a piece of hardware to run it on, or a cloud service to connect it to, or in the context of a different phone or something else. These things all have to link together. And in the linking together, they'll have different antiviruses on one device to another device. In the linking together, we need to collaborate on cybersecurity and provide that information in a way that's readily available across the world. We need to do it so we'll grow our business, but we also need to do it as people of the world so that we raise everybody to a greater capacity. That's the challenge for the Oxford Centre as far as I see it. Thank you.
So what we'd like to do now is open up the floor for debate and questions you might have. Yes, please.
Oh, okay. I probably should wait for the microphone.
Okay,
So,
that's all right.
Thank you. So first, I have two observations. They're not quite questions, but more comments. We heard that there are some ideas how to automate things so that we can automatically find when there is attack and also to combat those attacks and ideally deploy patches or other remedies to the system. So it might come as a shock to some people, but that is already being done today, and we do have communities who are casually handling multi-hundred gigabytes attacks on a daily basis, and it is going on today, right now, and it was going on for the last 5-6 years. So it isn't something that really new. We do have it, maybe it needs to be improved. Another problem with automatically applying patches or remedies. For full disclosure, I used to work for Cisco. I was the guy who was writing security advisories. I was the guy who was talking to ISPs. And the message from them is they will not apply any patches from any provider or any vendor whatsoever until they test it. So therefore, automation will have to wait. Not because we don't have a technical capacity. It is just not feasible because problems of breaking things. Thank you.
So, sort of to reply on that, agreed, it's not necessarily a new idea. The big challenge is the involvement of the public with those companies. Often those companies may be working on bequest of a few companies and actually working across sectors. And so this is the idea that that third layer of the triangle that's really missing is the involvement of public and then the nonprofit watchdogs, as opposed to just having sort of companies that support each other and actually make it a sort of a partnership.
Yes, at the back.
Sure. So it's actually a question for Bill Dutton. You did get questions after his presentation. So here, there was a point about trusting governments. Sorry, not trusting government. A question about whether the respondent thought the government was monitoring their communications. Did you ask questions specifically about one's own government versus other governments? Because I know there sometimes is a difference in opinion about which government is involved in monitoring.
No, it was framed government, and I think this was pre-Snowden topic. Very few people were probably. I mean, again, survey research. You never know what people interpret a survey research question to know. I mean, you can't interview everybody about what did you mean. But I think it was applied to their own government, own domestic governmental situation. But whatever way you define it, it was much higher than I would have imagined. Yep.
Okay, we have a Twitter question here, if I can just read that out. Question for David Bray. How is what he proposes possible anonymously? His idea is pre-schematikov.
And I would agree that actually what you would need is a trusted third party, and so that's where it probably needs to be a nonprofit. It may even be, for example, a global cybersecurity center. Just saying.
Hi, I'm Maria Farrell. I have a question for Professor von Solms. You mentioned there were peculiarly African attitudes to securing information and securing infrastructure. And I wonder, could you just elaborate a little bit on those, and also perhaps why the South African government hasn't involved itself in any practical cybersecurity capacity building measures?
Thank you very much. Can I just start off by making a comment which slipped my mind when I was making my presentation? I showed you the results, this very expensive product that we're distributing among schools. There was only one company that was interested in sponsoring this issue and this project as such, with a lot of money. Thank you very much to Microsoft for providing their input and helping this to go out to the schools. Your question, surely, firstly, I think there's a difference in terms of using mobiles, and already, I think David has already said, we've jumped a generation gap. Our kids and even our people out there working don't go through desktops, so they've got the mobile mentality, call it like that, and the banks, specifically the banks, are aggressively marketing this, which I also think many of the systems that they are marketing mobile-wise are too close to the edge. I've told them that, and they don't like it, but I think that's the fact. We're giving the users something that they are not prepared or not ready to use as such. Culture differences, to a big extent, in Africa, sharing is the important thing. You share with your people, you share your money, you share your whatever you've got. I think there's a much more open aspect, and therefore it's a little bit difficult. Now come and say, you don't share your password. It's part of a culture to share. And I think that's an issue that's very, very important. And that happens to a lot of other things. Another aspect of the African culture, I think, is to trust people. It's a fact. People trust other people. Therefore, I trust the fact, if I give you my cell phone and I give you my logon code, that you will not do something that will compromise me. And I think these are the type of approaches. Therefore, some of the research we're doing is to maybe take some of those decisions away from the end user by making the ISP more responsible for providing security. As far as the government is concerned, I just went, as I said, last Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I went with David and Alex to 6 of the biggest companies. And at 6 companies, the question that was asked, why are the government not moving? Coming from the major banks, coming from the major oil industries, etc. Why are the government not working? If you can get that answer, please give it to me. But I haven't got a clue. I think there are there may be some reasons. One of the guys opened up a little bit in terms of when we asked him that. Maybe David can react on that. It's a strange issue. And South Africa is suffering and to a certain extent Africa, because South Africa is supposed to provide the guidance in Africa. So I haven't got an answer, but it's an important one.
Nor me. We asked the question 6 times, as you said. We got no reasonable answer for it. Yes. Sorry.
Two questions. One specific one for David Pollington from Microsoft. This is Neil from the FCO, Neil Chauhan. And the specific question is, with 10, 11 years of experience under Microsoft's belt, are there lessons that we can learn in terms of what has particularly worked and what's not, either as specific cases or general principles that you've developed? And the second question, more broadly for the floor, is if we consider cybersecurity capacity building to be helping each other to develop and protect our physical security, economic security and values in cyberspace, I'm struck that if you knock off the last 2 words of that, in cyberspace, these are challenges that are being faced elsewhere in international development, in counterterrorism capacity building, in counter-narcotics capacity building. So I'm interested in learning from people about what has worked in other fields outside cyberspace and identifying what is different. And I'd just like to finally put a point forward, which to me, the challenge in cyberspace specifically is finding something that is both sustainable, where we can learn a lot from the international development initiatives, for example, but also scalable. Thank you.
Neil, are we on? Neil, thank you very much for your question. Of course, I'm thinking off the top of my head, and I'd rather we answer this with substance over time, and we connect the right people from our analyst team into the Oxford Centre. But the first thing to say is that what we learn is that it's easy to run an event, it's easy to make an announcement, it's easy to launch something. It's really hard to be in it for the long term and continue to do it. You know, we're in product delivery and evolution over the long term, and we've demonstrated that. And therefore, any initiative that we're involved in has to continue to grow. And I'd happily say, look at our security cooperation program, which had an early peak in the first few years, has had several injections of effort as people have said, oh, we should add this to it. Let's talk about law enforcement, or let's talk about this. And then those things have hived off and become separate initiatives as we engage with different communities. And that's the benefit of it. But honestly, also, we've reorganized recently, and we're taking that back in-house, and we're looking at it and saying, how could it do more? How could it be more useful? How would it change from 80 to 180? And so the lesson really is to continually question. Yes, have a 3-month, 6-month, 12-month plan in terms of what the world's going to see and what's going to come out. Maybe have a 3-year plan, but just assume that whatever you're doing needs to continually change. And the other thing is that we need to be, I would draw out the fact of being relevant. As we've grown over the years, just doing technical documentation, making it available in more and more languages has been really important to us. When I started with the company, doing hard translations, physical code translations of our products into other languages like Welsh was something that was difficult, and we put money and time into it, and we did that. Now, it's completely generic. We've built a language tree into our products. They all go back to source languages. You could replicate a new language if you needed to do so. It's that sort of systematic thinking that is required for an activity of this thought.
Thank you. Next question or comment? Yes, you have one here.
Thanks. Andrea Matuszyn from University of Pennsylvania. My question's for David Pollington. I was wondering if you could take us through the evolution of Microsoft's thinking on bug bounty programs and what you view your role, how you view the relationship changing, particularly with respect to Microsoft's role to the independent researcher community on the international scale, the evolution of gray, black markets and exploits, and how do you see that relationship of the governmental role, the corporate sector, and the realities of InfoSec dovetailing? Just a little question.
Wow, thank you for the best question of the day and the worst question. Everybody else doesn't have the time that we would need to answer that question, so I'm going to pick a few highlights and follow up with you later if that's all right. Just in case anybody doesn't know, the bug bounty programs that we've launched recently are very specific and very focused and very different to others around the community. So, in reality, I'm trying to remember the organization that started it, but about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a move to start to pay for bugs. And the market started to change. A company that was providing a perimeter defense decided that it would start to buy these things. Tipping Point is the first name that comes to mind. They may not have been the first, but they come to my mind. And they created a marketplace in saying, oh, actually, you don't just give it in for free and hope that Microsoft gives you a credit at the end by saying, you know, good job, well done, you know, we give our credits to this person. That was a shift which we stood back from, and we've stayed back from it. Our bug bounty program is a way of saying, not just give us a bug and we'll pay you anything for any bug you can find, or it's got to be a real security one, we pay more for the real security ones. We've focused on our own products and said, actually, right back in the days of Vista, when we made Vista and put it into the world, our security team blocked its existence in the world for 6 months, whilst we contracted 30 people from the outside world, security researchers, to work with us and test and break that thing. And then we fixed all that stuff before we released it to the world. Vista's not the greatest version of Windows, but it was one of the security huge steps that we made. And since then, we've learned to work with this community. I really welcome the fact that you introduce them as stakeholders, because in a different presentation I talk about in terms of norms of behavior in the internet for international security, I think they're an unconsulted group. So it's very important that they're brought in. But out of respect for them, it's also very important that we don't talk to them in a financial way. Yes, there are reasons for bounties. Yes, there are discrete programs that will help a product go through. But if we start to reduce that to the transaction of how much will you pay, what is that commodity, it takes all of the intellectual content out of it. And we need to make sure that's a proper stakeholder discussion with that particular community. I could go on and on, as you can tell. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. We had a question right here.
Also a question. Okay, I'm not sure if this is working.
So we'll try to spread the questions so we're not picking on Microsoft too much.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, this is actually one more Microsoft-related question. So in your presentation, there seemed to be kind of 3 big messages that I took across. One, we've been talking about this for way over a decade. Same things keep coming up. Number 2, there's an arms race that's been going on, and you guys have been running it, and it's proved to be fairly manageable as long as you keep innovating. And number 3, because it's manageable, there is just tremendous opportunity remaining in this space. So that's an incredibly copacetic story that definitely contrasts a lot with you know, the threat rhetoric that we hear from policymakers and whatnot. So am I interpreting that correctly, or are there some big things that Microsoft needs help with?
So to answer your question backwards, we will always welcome help. That's what I was trying to make the point with in terms of security research community. The world is bigger than us. We have one product in one space. It's a small layer. We thrive by collaboration. That's the way our business model works. And so in no sense do I want to imply that we don't need any help and we don't want to help, because we want to help and we want to collaborate. But standing back from that, you know, yes, we've had a lot of progress. Yes, we've learned a lot of things as we've gone through that process. But each time we learn, what we realize is that you have to move to this wider shell of collaboration and bring in different interests. And do you know what? I'm reconstructed. I'll be honest with you. I'm fed up with doing threat presentations. I could get all the data, I could scare people, I could tell you what happened this weekend. Why would I do that? Why does anybody need to be scared into taking action? Because it's apparent from what we heard this morning, everybody should be aware. They know where they can go to. They can go to an AV company, they can come to Microsoft, they can go to an independent researcher and find out the true story behind this particular threat. They can understand at what level they want to defend themselves based on what level of capability they have today, and that's a march. I welcome the Oxford maturity model, which I hope they'll talk about at some point today, because finding the position in that and providing the relevant guidance is the appropriate thing. In some places, you will only get people's attention by threatening them, in the sense of saying, I'm sorry, but do you realize how exposed you are? Here are the threats around you and you appear to be doing nothing. That type of scaremongering, I hope has had its day. I don't want to do it anymore. And that's why I've taken a more optimistic position that says, let's assume we know everything. And when somebody realizes that they don't know the same things that we're talking about in this room, they take us to one side and say, I'd like to learn that thing because I want to get it to that level and move more. So I'm inherently an opportunist, and I want to create a rising tide rather than this fear and doubt which dissuades people from using cyberspace.
Professor Creese.
Actually, as a change of tack, this is not a question for the panel. You can stand down. I just wanted to look the other way into the room, because this session is about what works and what doesn't. And of course, you are all aware that this wasn't an open registration event. Everybody was invited because we felt you had something real and interesting to contribute to this debate. And I was wondering if there's anyone in the room who has some burning experience on what works and what doesn't work that they would like to share with us.
I think I jumped the queue as a result of that question because there was someone before me. But I was going to make the point, actually, before Sadie asked that question, that it may be the case. I think one of the messages that came out of the presentations was a sort of sense that South African government's a bit complacent and that maybe companies are not doing enough to work out where their risks lie and that maybe we need a slightly different model for sharing information on this. If everyone else out there is complacent about it, actually there are a handful of companies who are not complacent about cyber security. In fact, most of the companies involved in cutting-edge research in this area, like my own, spend an awful lot of time thinking about how they can improve the security of data transmission in the digital world. And, you know, I think it's a figure that's often quoted that the problem is only 20% technology and 80% people. But actually, that 20% technology is crucially important. It's growing. I do sometimes wonder whether, you know, more could be made of that in South Africa or in countries which have not really latched on to this issue as an issue of public policy or awareness.
If I could take a shot at that first. We have to remember that half of the country's GDP comes from small and medium businesses. So this comes from SMBs, not companies with huge security resources to do this. The second thing you mentioned is that 20% of the solution relies on technology, and I'd agree with that. But we need to do something about the 80%. It's not like we can't manage these people in a way that helps us with that, bring that 80% down. And if we do, I think we're failing as managers. We're not managing those people effectively. So I agree with your points, with the exception of the fact that I don't think we can rely on technology for the SMBs who quite reasonably aren't aware of these things because they don't have the resources.
Yeah, can I just comment on that too? That 20% you referred to is quite true. But if we look at Africa and we look at some of the statistics, then most of the software in Africa, with all due respect to Microsoft, is illegal. It's not licensed. So it's not patched. So, and that's not an excuse. It should not be an excuse. But the excuse is, look, we haven't got money to pay for that. So we get illegal software. We can't afford to have our antivirus packages updated. Therefore, my contention is we need another model. We need another way of protecting the end user, which is not the normal model. Not saying update your operating system, get the latest operating system, get the latest patches, get the latest antivirus. There must be other ways. And one of the ways that we're looking at very clearly is to move that responsibility. I've said it. If you have a sort of a scale of financial scale of equivalence, in the sense that, and in some countries it's happening, that the government actually supports ISPs. The government provides financial support to ISPs to provide a wider level of security. And eventually in Africa, my vision is that anybody should be able to link onto the internet going through some trusted third party ISP, call it what you want, that takes that responsibility. But that's not necessarily a model that needs to work in the developed world. But you're quite right, the human side is the biggest side. And we talked about the trust. But don't forget, even if we've got a 20% technology side, it's different in that area. And we have to provide something like that. You can't just say, you must get it.
But I think it's a very appreciated comment that 80% of the problem is on the human side.
That's a fact.
I just want to make a very quick clarification. Where a piece of Microsoft software is pirated and we can reach it, we will patch it. The patching is not conditional on licensing.
Ivan.
Yeah. I don't know if I need a mic or not. I'm pretty loud anyway. So,
you do, I think, for the internet audience.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Well, I just
Can
wanted
we
to
get
say...
Maybe you can wait until I'm done.
All right. A lot of these points together is something Andrea mentioned earlier about the flaming river. This may have to do with culture too, because how you get things done in a country and in a polity often depends on sort of a mid-level of entrepreneurs we tend to call politicians, right? So you're not going to get policy
if you don't have advocacy for it, right? In other words, if you don't have basically a demand for a policy change, you're not going to get anybody standing up there and saying, well, we need policy change, right? They're not going to get the votes for it. So it's a very simple sort of observation that Andrea's Flaming River thing is a reference to an environmental disaster, which did then sort of panic people into seeking remission from their congressmen, getting laws passed that ultimately changed the environment. And one of the difficulties and one of the reasons why we see so much complacency in governments, or might be, I would speculate, is that so many of the costs of cyber crime, cyber damage, cyber threats are invisible. They sort of live there under the surface, and we as a community see them all the time, and it kind of freaks us out. But the average everyday person on the street doesn't even know that Barclays has just been hacked, because their account is sort of seamlessly taken care of as a result of that. So unless there is a Flaming River, it's going to be very difficult to sort of get that middle level of politicians to sort of stand up and say, okay, we really take this really seriously, because everybody can just either deny that they've been hacked or that the threat is real. And I would just say that's sort of probably squares the circle.
Let me get a response here.
So in response to Basie and yourself, I really hope that we can save, you know, if you talked about the developing world leapfrogging the developments we've had in the developed world, I really hope we can, because what's happened in the developed world is really in a way quite, you know, I mean, the development's not gone in a good way. Yeah. It's quite scandalous, and I'm sorry, David, have to really strongly object to say, like, if only we could make people toe the line. We wouldn't have a security problem, right?
If only we could make people
yeah, when you
toe
say
the
like
line.
80% of the cybersecurity problem is a people
I don't mean toe the line.
But it is very often that's the way of how in corporate environments and in company customer relationship it's interpreted. Now, I just wanted to highlight that actually I think the problem is, and a few. You know, a group of researchers think the problem is really that security's just gotten completely out of hand. That what's required, what you need to do in order to be secure is just disproportionate and far too disruptive to people's everyday lives, to the productive activity in organizations. And I haven't heard that said today. It's like the kind of security we need can't eat all the profits of our productive activity. It can't eat up all the time that people have for their spare time activities or for things they want to do for education, whatever. And I think what I would really hope we can leapfrog for the development.
Well, so if I could just answer this point, since you mentioned toe the line, I absolutely don't mean this.
Okay, good.
What happened, and I think it's what happened, for example, with safety years ago, wasn't telling people, toe the line, otherwise you're fired. That didn't happen. What happened was, progressively, a culture was built in which it was seen in mutual interest that we work on this together. And that's my hope for cybersecurity. It's in our mutual interest to work on this together, progressively, over time, rather like Toyota did with its manufacturing systems, but certainly not something where you say, do this or you're fired. That's completely counterproductive.
Thanks, I'm glad we agree.
Can I just comment quickly on what Angela says, and I totally agree with you. Let's just go back to what David has said. The problem is that many of the mobile phones do not use Microsoft. That's a totally new issue. And the Android market is a big problem, because that's where we're going. And this leapfrogging, I think that's core to what we're talking about. And we must take that into account in trying to find solutions. And we must find solutions from the mobile. Forget about desktops. Forget about tablets. Forget about laptops. They're not relevant, or they're very little relevant, and they're going to get less relevant. Let's start thinking about solutions for the mobile market. And that's not necessarily Microsoft, although they're doing a lot of work.
And I do want to sort of, I want to say that, make a note, if you're ever on a panel with at least 3 Davids, it's going to be very lively, but separate from that. Your point about making sure it's something that's sort of baked into what they do is well taken, and I think that's, as the internet becomes much more ubiquitous in what we're doing, how can we bake in security and privacy by design becomes a very key point for everybody.
And by work design. Yes, a gentleman at the back.
Yes, Michael Mainelli from Zien. Good afternoon. I was interested to hear this discussion about towing the line, managing people, and yet we can't spend an infinite amount. I was very interested to hear the gentleman from South Africa introduce finance. And we started off this morning with an analogy to do with automobiles. In the City of London, the financial district, we have a discussion going on, something called cyber reinsurance, which is really to inject a lot of the market discipline that's needed in here so that people understand that the amount of security that they take on gets them a compensatory risk obligation, which is being taken on by the insurance industry itself. This is injecting market forces, I think, to allow you to do some of these types of cost-benefit equations. There are examples. Insurance in the United Kingdom in 1992-93 dried up due to terrorism, the St. Mary Axe bomb and the Bishopsgate bomb. And in between, the government set up something called Pool Re, which took on physical reinsurance risk. We've seen similar things after 9/11. And I'm curious what the panel might think about really injecting the discipline that manages to get us all on the road safely, which is that we adhere to what our automobile insurer does, and we consider it a crime. When your neighbor says, oh, I thought I'd do without seatbelts, you say, do you realize your policy might be invalidated? What would these approaches do to put some reality into this conversation? Thank you.
I want to at least say from the perspective from those of us in the States, those conversations have been had, because the nice thing about insurance is it does force people to actually start doing measurements and start having audits, and it actually does allow the CEO to understand what are they getting as they add more security in terms of the trade-off for what the company might have down the road. So actually I would say that's definitely a fruitful line of discussion to consider.
I just want to, as the business person, wholly disagree with the idea of cost-benefit analysis. This is something that is the first level of attack for a manager. The reality is both costs and benefits are dynamic. They move all the time. One of the difficulties we have, aside from cost-benefit, one of the difficulties we have in security is convincing people that there is sustainable competitive advantage from this. That's different than cost-benefit, which is going to change all the time. And it is true that you have to audit companies, and this is kind of the first level of stuff that you have to do, but it's by no means the source of long-term viability of a company.
Okay, and I wanted to add a different perspective from the point of view of, I don't know about the insurance side, but I welcome the risk assessment and risk management. That's what's missing. There's nowhere near enough cybersecurity risk assessment and management going on. People continuously complain about Microsoft updates and the fact that that breaks their systems. And nobody ever asked the question, well, when was that system made? Do you still have the people who wrote it? Exactly what is it used for? And so if that could be introduced by whatever mechanism, such that anybody responsible for a company was responsible for the state of support and update of all the software, not just a few moving parts, then I think it could be a big step forward.
Yes, gentleman at the front here.
No, there's a question already over there.
Oh, you got a question already over here, who's close to the microphone, which gives you preference.
Ah,
there we go. You're very close to the microphone.
Yeah, extremely close. Mike Levy from Cardiff. Yeah, I agree with Dave Upton's response there. I think you have to see it as dynamic. And perhaps one might all even integrate that with Bill Dutton's earlier papers and say costs and benefits for different segments of the population, not just for the official security managers. And in a way, one of the takeaways that I've got from this afternoon, I was on a flight to get here this morning, so I missed that. But I think it may be a mistake to think of cybersecurity as a holistic construct. I'm sure Sadie and others don't. But there's so many different components, and we really need to segment cybersecurity so that it doesn't become just like national threat.
Thank you. Let's take one more question. We can probably take two. So one from Bill.
Thanks. Robert Hercott from British Telecom. On the risk issue that's just raised, I think that's critical. First of all, human beings are inherently bad at risk analysis. So most people assess flying as a dangerous activity, whereas cycling they think is safe. You know, the odds are about 1,000,000 to 1 against. And the same with terrorism. You know, your odds of being struck by lightning are higher than a terrorist attack. So we're just inherently bad at risk assessment, and particularly in the cyber domain, where the signals don't exist. We didn't evolve to read the signals from a virtual domain. Therefore, we have zero ability to assess risk in cyber, and that's inherent.
So I would completely agree with it. You can overcome that by visualizing. And so there's some fun infographics you can find on the web that show exactly you're much more at risk by driving a car than flying a plane. And so what we need is the ability to actually visualize what are the risky behaviors on the internet that we should be concerned of.
There's a good academic book on this, by the way, called The Science of Fear, which outlines exactly the things that you're describing with empirical examples.
I just wanted to make one final point. I agree with the assessment that you made by comparison, but I would disagree fundamentally that we have zero ability, because many of us have quite a lot of ability. What exists is a very broad spread zero will. There is a lack of will.
You have ability, they don't.
They have the ability, they just have no will to do it, and no appetite.
My question was when we invoke government to do something about it, who in government? And my sense is that it's awfully fragmented in terms of government response. Is there any new thinking about where cybersecurity belongs? I mean, for example, should the communication regulator do this as consumer protection, or is there any new thinking around who's in charge here in government?
At least when I was trying to pitch the commons idea, I would say you start at a national level because that's easier. International gets a lot harder. And it really does need to be something that's outside of government, as a public-private partnership that's involving academia, that's involving nonprofits, that is involving for-profits, and then most importantly, members of the public.
Okay, at this point I'd like to thank my panelists for joining in with us. I apologize a little bit for foisting my strong opinions on you as chair. But thank you very much for some great questions, and it's time for our break. Thank you.